Hey you guys, this is Jessica and Noam here with Reverb at Trax Recording. Today we are looking at how to get the dry 70s disco drum sound.
Think Donna Summer, think Chic, think the Village People. They all have big, fat, short snare drums, little teeny tiny hi-hats, tight little kicks. We're gonna figure out how to do it.
For our drums, we used a Ludwig Vista-like kick drum, and we stuffed that with a sleeping bag to really shorten the sound. And then we used a Ludwig Acrolite snare drum with a big fat snare drum on top of it to shorten that sound as well. And then we used K-Sweet Zildjian hi-hats, 14-inch. For the toms, we used a 13-inch and a 16-inch Gretsch, and we put cloth over them to dampen some of the overtones or to shorten the sound. And then we used an 18-inch Zildjian K Dark Crash.
All right, so getting the disco sound starts with the treatment of the drums. They have to be really, really specific. There's a really fine line when you're tightening the snare drum tension where it is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and it gets short enough, and then almost immediately it starts to choke out the bottom end of the drum, right? So finding that exact sweet spot where you have the right amount of length but also the right amount of body is super key. You also have to make sure that your kick drum is as short as it can be. You have to make sure that your hi-hats are not getting played too loud. Once you have all those things in order, we start miking up the drums. The miking placement on this particular brand of disco that we decided to do is really, really separate. Every single element, it sounds like it's recorded as an overdub or something like that, right? And the only way to achieve that is to be primarily using direct microphones, right? So your overheads, you don't think of them like they are the sound of your entire drum kit, right? They are the sound of just the cymbals. To achieve that, we're gonna EQ out all the low end, right? We're gonna use a bunch of shelving with our SSL EQ, and we're gonna get rid of any semblance of drums in them and leave only the hi-hats. The other thing that I noticed with all of these older records is that the hi-hats tend to be very bright, but they're also strangely soft, right? And those two things are kind of at odds with each other. When you brighten stuff up, it tends to start to get harder edged and start to get usually a little bit more piercing and all these things, right? That's where tape is doing a lot of the work for you, right? Back at the era that we're trying to recreate, which is the 70s, they were recording the tape, and they were also fighting with the issue of noise in tape, right? The signal to noise ratio, right? There's a lot of noise inherent in a tape machine. And so in order to fight that noise, you have to record everything as hot as you can withstand. The louder that you record it into the tape, the less of the noise is because the actual signal is louder, right? When you turn drums up, you can turn them up really loud into the tape machine, and the byproduct is that it's gonna lob off all of the attacks, all these really sharp transients from the hi-hat, it's gonna lob them off. It's essentially causing distortion, but if you do it very tastefully, it sounds musical. So we did that with a plugin called Satin, that is a tape emulation plugin, and we put it on all of our drums, but on our overheads, we were really driving that plugin a lot so that we would get this very bright but very round sound. On our kick drum, we were using a D12. This is from the era, and it's really, really vintage sounding, right? It's kind of this classic, immediately your drum just sounds like it's coming out of the 70s. it also is not a super low-endy microphone, right? It's not like a AKG D112, let's say, which comes with a ton of low end built into the mic. This has a really like balanced sound, so it doesn't really accentuate the low end, and the result is we get this really kind of modest kick drum sound that is appropriate for that style of music, right? We don't need this super boomy sound because it's going to be hitting on every beat, right? With this, it's going to give us a lot of attack, it's going to give us a lot of mid-range, but it's not going to give us a ton of low end. Okay, so let's listen to just the snare. So for the snare drum, we started out with what I thought was going to be a perfect mic for this, which was an AKG 451, right? That is a pencil condenser, small diaphragm condenser mic. It's really well-rounded in its low end and high end, right? So it sounds really great on snares. The only problem is that when we put it up, we were getting too much hi-hat bleed off of that microphone, right? A condenser microphone, it picks up a lot more around it. So it picked up a lot of hi-hat, and the separation that I was looking for, where the hi-hat was only over on the left side and then the snare was just in the center, it wasn't really happening with that mic. So we swapped it out for our gold standard SM57, the same one that every single person uses. And to supplement it, we had to EQ a little bit of extra high end into it, a little bit of extra low end, take a little bit of mid-range out, and the result is we ended up with a pretty similar snare sound, but with a lot less hi-hat in it. We also, just to accentuate the separation, we added a noise gate to this sound. We used just the noise gate on the SSL and just made it so that every time the snare drum hit, it would open up the noise gate, but every time it wasn't hitting, when it was just hi-hat, it would drop it down about 15 decibels so that we could get a more separated sound. The last piece of the kick and snare was we needed to have extra punch, right? That is very specific to this genre, is that the kick and snare, it's gotta be punchy. And I used a really specific compressor to achieve that, which is a DBX 165A compressor. This is a compressor that has an auto attack and auto release mode, right? So it's pretty much just point and shoot, right? You can change the ratio and you can change how much you're pushing into it, but I have it on the auto setting, so it's pretty much just preset what it's gonna do. And the thing that it does is it adds a really great amount of snap to kick and snare, right? It sounds like this, when you run things through this, it sounds the way that kick drums and snare drums sounded in the 70s. That's what this compressor does. You don't even have to use it very much, right? On an 1176, you might be, hitting at 4 or 5 decibels compression to really get the sound of that to speak. On a DBX 160, you're just hitting 1 or 2 decibels of compression, and it just clamps down so aggressively that it makes it feel like it has this really sharp attack and kick that feels perfect for disco music. Let's listen to just the kick and snare together with those compressors. For the toms, we used AKG 414s, right? That's so that we didn't have to EQ them like crazy, right? They already came a little bit scooped, right? They had a lot of low end and a nice amount of high end. A lot of the tom sound is also just the treatment of the drums. We put the cloth over them and it makes it sound kind of scooped just like inherently. We only had to use a little bit of these tom mics to supplement what was already there for it to sound fantastic. For our overheads, we used a pair of Shep's V4U condenser microphones. These are small diaphragm condensers. They are really well balanced, really detailed, and they are perfect for if you just want to capture cymbals and for it to sound natural. So as I said earlier, we EQ'd a bunch of low end out. We also added a bunch of saturation with the tape plugin. And the placement of these was crazy wide. It looks like someone does not know how to mic drums when you look at where these mics are placed, but it makes it so directional. There's a ton of phase cancellation between the two microphones, so there's basically no center image at all in these overheads, right? Once we add that with our kick and snare, the stylized sound kind of makes sense. So let's listen to just the overheads first. It sounds crazy on its own, right? It doesn't make sense as a drum sound alone, right? But let's add in kick and snare. Now, we did a couple extra things just to finish off this sound. We added a little bit of reverb just on the snare. For that, we used an EMT 140 plate, and we used it with about an 80 millisecond pre-delay so that it didn't make the snare sound further away, just kind of added some ambience around it, right? A little separation between the snare drum and the reverb. Now, the last thing we did was we added a little bit of parallel compression to this drum sound, right? We did that with a pair of 1176s, and that is just taking the entire drum kit and running it through 1176s with maybe 4 to 5 decibels of compression going at a 4-to-1 ratio. Now, if I were to just compress this with a compressor slapped on the drums, not in parallel, every time the kick drum and the snare drum hit together, they're going to detract from one another, right? Because they're getting compressed together. So the kick drum is going to be at this volume, and when this kick drum and snare drum hit together, it's going to compress it, so the kick drum volume is going to drop compared to the beats where the snare drum is not playing. That's a problem if that's the entirety of our sound, right? That can start to get really problematic quickly. So instead, I'm going to do it in parallel, right? Now what that's going to do is it's going to end up with that same problem, right? It's going to detract, but I have the dry drums to fill it in to add that extra impact when they hit together. So that's not really a noticeable thing. So I get all of the benefits of this compression, which is the added energy, and I get a little bit of added punch, but I don't lose any of the things that I would lose if I just used a compressed sound. So here's just the compressed sound. Now here's just the drum sound without the compression. And now here's all of them together. So that's all the pieces. Let's listen to them all together. We had Jessica play a few different disco beats to like put this sound through its paces. Let's check it out. That's how we got that hot disco sound.
As always, let us know in the comments what other hot sounds you'd like us to break down for you, and we'll see you next time.